And now, making his way to the studio, he once used communion wafers in place of nachos. It's Mike Smithgall.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I'm Mike Smithgall, the unelected mayor of Atheistville, and this is today's Mic Drop. Today, I want to dig into something Penn Jillette once pointed out, and it's stuck with me ever since. Our legal system recognizes guilty, not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. What you won't find is not guilty because God told me to do it. Now, that may sound obvious, but think about what that really says. In a culture where millions claim divine instruction in their daily lives, where politicians talk openly about God telling them to run for office, where extremists have justified violence by invoking divine will, the courts draw a hard line. God told me doesn't fly in front of a judge. And that divide between faith and the law tells us something profound about secularism, fairness, and responsibility. Let's break it down. The first thing to recognize is that the legal system, at least in principle, is secular. That doesn't mean judges and juries are free of personal faith, far from it. But the system itself is not supposed to favor one religion over another, or religion over non-belief. It's grounded in rules, procedures, and standards of evidence. Now, if we allowed God told me as a valid defense, the entire framework collapses. Which God? Whose God? How do we determine whether the defendant actually received divine instruction? Do we cross-examine the Almighty on the witness stand? Do we subpoena angels as expert witnesses? Obviously, that's ridiculous. We don't do that. The absurdity becomes obvious the moment you try to operationalize it. Penn Jillette's observation is simple but powerful. Divine revelation has no standing in secular law. That's not because the courts are hostile to religion. It's because revelation is personal, unverifiable, and subjective. The law has to be universal. What counts as evidence for me must count as evidence for you, no matter what your beliefs. Think about how fragile justice would be otherwise. One person says God told them to kill their neighbor. Another says God told them to steal. And third insists that God commanded them to commit arson. If divine instruction were admissible, every courtroom would descend into theological chaos. Secularism, in this sense, is not about erasing religion. It's about creating a neutral space where disputes are settled by standards everyone can access, facts, evidence, and reason. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Contrast this with not guilty by reason of insanity defense. Unlike divine instruction, insanity has a defined legal and medical framework. It's not just someone saying, I felt like it was the right thing to do. It's an evaluation of whether the defendant understood the nature of their actions or knew what they were doing was in fact wrong. The insanity defense rests on mental capacity, not belief. A person may genuinely believe voices are commanding them, but the issue isn't whether these voices are divine, it's whether the mental faculties were impaired. Can they distinguish right from wrong? Do they understand reality? That's the threshold. Now, religious conviction doesn't automatically equal impairment, far from it. Billions of people pray, they read scripture, they claim divine guidance while functioning perfectly well in society. You may disagree with their beliefs, but legally, they're not considered detached from reality in the same way someone suffering from untreated schizophrenia may be. This distinction is crucial. Insanity defenses require psychiatric evaluation, expert testimony, and careful legal standards. They don't rest on faith. They rest on whether the defendant had the cognitive ability to grasp their action. That's why God told me to do it isn't recognized. It doesn't necessarily indicate a failure of mental capacity. It may show conviction. It may show fanaticism. But unless paired with demonstrable mental illness, it doesn't meet the legal threshold. The law recognizes impaired minds. It does not recognize religious commands. That's not bias, that's coherence. Let's imagine for a moment what would happen if the courts did allow God told me to do it as a valid defense. Just picture that scenario for a second. The floodgates would open. Suddenly, every crime would be cloaked in theological justification. A murderer could claim that they were carrying out divine judgment. A thief could argue they were merely following biblical examples where God rewarded the chosen with the spoils. Even terrorism could be excused as obedience to divine will. What's the safeguard? There isn't one. That's why law cannot and does not make room for personal revelation. Because if it did, the law would no longer be the law. It would be theology, and a theology that bends to whoever shouts God the loudest. Religious authority, when inserted into law, has historically led to disaster. Think of the witch trials, inquisitions, or blasphemy laws still enforced in parts of the world today. In those systems, divine authority is the justification for punishment, and the result is cruelty, fear, and arbitrary enforcement. Penn Jillette's point, then, is not only about why a God told me defense doesn't exist, it's about why it must never exist. The strength of secular law is that it keeps justice tied to human responsibility, not divine decree. When the law recognizes only evidence and human reason, it prevents societies from collapsing into competing revelations. It ensures no one can outsource accountability to a higher power. Responsibility remains squarely with the person who acted, not the God they invoked. Now, we don't have to rely on hypothetical here. History gives us plenty of examples of people claiming God told them to commit horrific acts. Take Andrea Yates in 2001. A suburban mother and former nurse, she drowned her 5 children in Houston, Texas. I remember this very clearly. Yates later explained that she believed she was saving her children from eternal damnation, acting on what she thought was God's will. She wasn't a cult follower, nor was she plotting violence with some radical group. She was, in every outward sense, a normal mother. The tragedy came when postpartum psychosis overtook her. Ultimately, the court found her not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, notice how the religious framing didn't matter legally. What mattered was the medical evidence of severe impairment. Now, contrast that with Robert Deere Jr. in 2015. Deere opened fire at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, killing 3 people and injuring 9. He described himself as, I quote, a warrior for the babies, unquote, and insisted that God has commanded him to act against abortion providers. Unlike Yates, Deere wasn't evaluated as legally insane in the same way. His statements weren't incoherent. They were language of conviction, not delusion. Yet his invocation of God's authority carried no legal weight. He was still held accountable for murder. Now, these cases reveal a pattern. When someone claims divine command, the court doesn't take God's word in evidence. The only time religion enters into the picture is when it intersects with a diagnosable mental illness. Otherwise, God told me has zero standing in court. And that's exactly how it should be. Without that firewall, the courtroom becomes a pulpit and justice turns into dogma. You know, this reminds me of Carl Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World, which lays out beautifully why evidence must guide our understanding, not personal revelation. It's really worth checking out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Hey, a quick pause. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you join the community here. We're building a space of honest conversation about faith, about doubt, about reason. Subscribing is free, but it helps people find these discussions and it helps keep this project growing. And I want to ask you to do one more thing. Leave a comment. I read every single one of these comments, and even if we disagree, I will respectfully respond to you. Your comments don't just help shape the conversation. They also show YouTube that this is a community worth recommending. All right, let's get back to it. Here's where Penn Jillette's point takes on a deeper meaning. Religious claims often serve as tools of power. When someone says, God told me to, they're invoking authority that cannot be questioned. Who are you to argue with God? The statement shuts down debate. It shifts the responsibility upward and shields the individual from accountability. In daily life, that can sound harmless enough. A pastor says God told him to plant a church. A politician claims God told her to run for office. People interpret coincidences or gut feelings as divine nudges. That all sounds fine. But scale that up to the justice system and you see the danger. If courts allowed people to shift blame onto the divine command, responsibility evaporates. Human agency is erased, replaced by untestable claims of higher authority. That's why secular law resists it. The system insists on human accountability. If you take a life, it's on you. If you steal, it's on you. If you set fire to a building, that's on you. You could believe God wanted it, but the law will treat it as your action, your crime, because it's your choice. This insistence on responsibility protects fairness and ensures that no one can invoke unchallengeable authority to excuse themselves. And in a culture still saturated with religious language, that separation is not only important, it's vital for justice to function. Jillette's observation highlights something we sometimes take for granted. The secular nature of our justice system is not just a bureaucratic quirk, it's a safeguard. It's the firewall that keeps law grounded in what can be proven and shared across belief systems. In the South, where I grew up, it was common to hear phrases like, God told me to in everyday conversation. Maybe God told someone to take that new job. Maybe God told them to marry their high school sweetheart. in that cultural setting, divine guidance it's woven into daily life. I don't even really notice it. But step into a courtroom and suddenly that language doesn't carry weight. Why? Because the law belongs to everyone. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and atheists, people of all faiths and people of no faith. It cannot privilege one tradition's revelation over another's. By necessity, it levels the playing field. Now, that's not hostility towards religion. It's protection for everyone. Without secular law, justice becomes theology by majority vote, and minorities, religious or not, are left vulnerable. So when Penn Jillette points out that God told me to do it doesn't exist as a defense, it's not just a witty observation. It's a reminder that fairness requires secularism. Justice requires evidence. Responsibility requires human accountability. The legal system, flawed as it is, at least gets that right. Belief may shape motives, but belief is not an alibi. All right, so that's today's mic drop. Courts don't recognize God told me to do it because justice depends on evidence, not revelation. Real accountability means laws can't be bent around personal faith. It has to protect everyone. All right, that's my 2 cents. Unblessed, unfiltered, agree or disagree. That's what I got for you today. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed the show, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone else who might appreciate it. And by the way, if you or someone you know would make a great guest, then reach out to me. Let's connect. Until next time, take care, and remember, reason and compassion go a very, very long way.